Good morning. It's already pretty quiet, isn't it? Well, we can all huddle together for warmth, if you like. It's a bit of a fresh morning, isn't it? Well, welcome to Open Circle. My name is Phil Rylett, and welcome. We'd like to ask you out of respect for our presenters, if you could all turn your cell phones off. And with a bit of luck, I'll remind you to turn them back on afterwards. Now, we have a special guest this morning reading the Open Circle mission statement. Where's she gone? Oh, there you are. Today's Open Circle mission statement will be read by Lynn Atkinson. There you go.
Thank you. I think my hip needs a lube job. Open Circle provides a supportive environment to gather for social interaction and to improve our understanding of ourselves, our community, and our world. Presentations span a wide range of intellectual, cultural, physical, and spiritual topics. We do not necessarily agree with the ideas and philosophies of our presenters. We encourage you to listen with an open mind and form your own opinions.
Excellent, Lynn. Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. God, we are moving right along, aren't we, today? Okay. Now, if you'd like to receive a weekly announcement of upcoming programs, please put your name and email address on the sign-up list over by Brad. There's a clipboard there. And, of course, you can always sign up by going to our website, opencircleihe.org. Just by show of hands, how many people have actually been to see the... Should I wait this slowly? A few more people to raise their hands. They were coming slowly. Okay. Well, I encourage you to go there and check out the site. Yeah, the website. Thank you, Bill. It's opencircleihe.org. Yeah. Well, you're a hostile crowd today, aren't you? Now, and actually on the website, we will be having shortly links to Brad's, our videographer's YouTube site. And Open Circle, together with Brad, have partnered to bring you all the Open Circle episodes for free. And a Gmail address no longer required. Everyone is invited to go to Brad's YouTube channel, located at YouTube. The best thing is just to go to YouTube and put in the search chapaladrone, all one word, chapaladrone. Then you get to Brad's site. You'll see all our. You can do a search on all our videos for Open Circle. Now, Brad is in the middle of uploading all of them. Imagine there's 5 years worth of videos to upload. So they're not all there yet. How far are you through? About?
For the old episodes, I think we're at 114.
Out of 500? Okay, so not too bad. So if your favorite one's not there, be patient. It will be soon. Now, I'm going to give you a few jokes. So I'm going to talk about flying today. I hate flying. I don't know about you. I fly regularly from Sacramento to Guadalajara. And I have two choices. I have Aeromexico or Volaris. See whether you can spot which one this is. So I went up to the ticket counter and I said, the ticket lady said, well, how many bags have you got? And I said, I've got 3. And she said, okay, I got 3. And I said, look, can you send one to Cancun, one to Puerto Vallarta, and one to Mexico City? She says, no, we can't do that. I said, well, you had no problem last month. So we're checking in for a flight, and she asked, you want window or aisle? And I said, window or you'll what? That's a Three Stooges joke, I think. So we're taxiing down the tarmac. We abruptly stopped, turned around, and went back to the gate. After an hour-long wait, it finally took off. So I asked the flight attendant, I said, well, what was the problem? He said, oh, the pilot heard a noise, and he was bothered by the noise he heard in the engine. And it took us a while to find a new pilot. How are we doing? It says that it was mealtime, and the flight crew came around and said, I said, do you have a choice? They said, yeah. Yes or no? I picked the right one, guess which? As we were getting off, the pilot was there, and I saw him, and I said, it was a really rough landing. I said, did we land or were we shot down? No? And I said, you know, you're a pilot. I said, that must be exciting. He says, well, not if I do it right. We all in with the, okay. Our words of wisdom. Eagles soar, but weasels don't get sucked into jet engines. Okay. Words to live by. Now, next week's presentation will be The Dimensions of the Universe. The Dimensions of the Universe in You, presented by Kenneth Hunt. The real miracle of the existence of the universe is that the whole manifestation, everything that is knowable, emerges from inherent properties of the very stuff of which it all consists. It might be helpful for us to have a sharpened sense of where we stand in the scale of things that have emerged from the turmoil of the Big Bang. Now, before we can do that, however, we need to increase our understanding of millions, billions, trillions, and their relative sizes. Ken will explore several ways to appreciate relationships among big numbers, and then we'll explore the dimensions of the universe. It sounds a little up there, but it's a great talk. Ken is a science nerd. He has been reading and thinking a lot about stuff like this for a long time, and he has learned a lot, and he wants to interest you in it too. Okay? Now, we have today's centering moment. Today's centering moment will be led by David Dennis.
What a fine bunch of people we have here today. Get settled in your chair, and I'm going to borrow a technique that we learned about here, that I learned about here a couple weeks ago from Julian, about how to get real into the present moment. So instead of thinking about what you're going to have for lunch or what's going on next week or next year or next decade, look around and notice 4 things that you see. Keep your eyes open for this one. Look around, 4 things you see. Take 5 seconds, just notice 4 things you see. Now take a moment and notice 3 things you hear. 3 things you hear. Let all those things in the future that haven't happened yet, and all those things in the past that might have been bothering you before you sat here right now, let them all go. Come back into this moment within your own body and rest fully in your chair. Close your eyes if you wish, and meditate on the fullness of your particular present moment. We'll be doing this for the next minute and a half. Take another breath or two. open your eyes and be fully present for our speaker's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, we're ahead of the game here. You know, one thing I did forget to do this morning was ask for acknowledging new people here for the first time today. So do we have anyone here who's here for the first time? If you can stand up, we could all give you an acknowledgement and a round of applause. All right, thank you. Welcome to Open Circle. Now, today's presentation is Recovering in Chaos Part 2, presented by Pete Soderman. Now, last fall, Pete addressed Open Circle on his new project, Recovering in Chaos, in which he explored the then current situation in the US and explained why the environment makes recovery from self-defeating behaviors such as drug abuse so difficult. In this presentation, Pete will discuss how the situation has worsened in the past year, some attempts to mitigate the problem, and where his research is suggesting some solutions may lie. It turns out there may be a light at the end of the tunnel that isn't an oncoming train. Pete has nearly 30 years of experience in the recovery field and is the author of Powerless No Longer, Reprogramming Your Addictive Behavior, and Thinking Recovery, A Cognitive Approach to Self-Defeating Behaviors. His website is petesoderman.com. Please welcome Pete Soderman. Yes.
Good morning. My name's Pete Soderman. The speaker who's coming was foretold to you. I'm happy to be here this morning, and I'd like to thank Open Circle for allowing me to speak to you once again. This is the 6th or 7th time I've done that. I guess if you want to see my prior talks now, you can go up to the website and take a look at them. For those that don't know me, I'm a computer engineer by trade with a background in computer design, software development, system sales, networking, and consulting. I've had a couple of other careers too, including teaching computer science at a community college, and even a couple of years driving a truck. So I've had a rather eclectic life up to now. The bottom line is that I'm just an ordinary guy who was willing to do a great deal of research into a subject in which I had a vested interest. Because in addition to the above, I also had a 26-year drinking career that took me to some places that I never want to go again. So far, I've written 2 books about addiction, as Phil said. Powerless No Longer, Reprogramming Your Addictive Behavior, and Thinking Recovery, A Cognitive Approach to Self-Defeating Behaviors. I wrote Powerless because I saw a need, and I wanted to do what I could to spread the word about cognitive recovery techniques in an environment that at the time was openly hostile to the idea that there might be a better, or at least an alternate way to approach recovery than the traditional 12-step modality. Today, most of that hostility has dissipated, at least in the professional community, primarily due to a number of studies in the last several years demonstrating the efficacy of cognitive tools. Powerless No Longer is still selling well on Amazon in hard copy audio and Kindle formats. Thinking Recovery is available for free on my website. While I was writing Powerless 6 years ago, I used Open Circle as a kind of sounding board for the ideas I was working on and thinking of incorporating into the book. I found the process very helpful, so I'm using it again for my new effort, which I call Recovering in Chaos. I'm using the word chaos in the classical sense as meaning the antithesis of order. In an ordered system, if you do X, you have a reasonable expectation that the result will be Y. In a chaotic system, you have no expectation because results are largely unpredictable. The basic premise of the book is that the current chaotic conditions in the United States are doing more to drive the explosive growth of addiction and overdose problems than any other single factor, and that those same conditions are making it more difficult in general for substance abusers to recover. Last year, when I spoke to you, I didn't have any direct, hard evidence for these ideas, just some interpolations from some existing studies and some very strong feelings. Today, that's no longer true. I quoted several studies last year, enough facts and figures to glaze over the eyes of almost everybody who was here. And I'm not going to repeat that mistake this year, although there will be a few numbers just to put things in perspective. For instance, I reported last year that 64,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2016, and I mentioned that we were on track to eclipse that in 2017. In fact, we did. 72,000 Americans died from overdoses last year, a 12% increase, as the epidemic continues to escalate. A year ago, I didn't have a clear idea of who my new book should be primarily directed to, or even what I wanted to say. I also had a problem with the why of the epidemic. I had a theory that it was somehow tied to the chaotic environment in the United States and maybe the world, but I couldn't prove it. So there I was. I wanted to write a self-help book, and I didn't know or couldn't prove who the primary audience might be, why they were behaving in that manner, or what I was going to say to them. Even fiction writers have to answer these W questions before they begin a story. But of course, they have the advantage of being able to make everything up. I couldn't do that. So I kept on doing research. To make a long story short, it turned out that I was looking for the answers in the wrong places. I was searching primarily through the papers and studies by experts in the addiction field, people whose names I knew well, and in an area which I was thoroughly familiar. It was the research equivalent of looking for your keys under the lamppost because that's where the light was best. It turns out the answers I was seeking were to be found not in the archives of neurophysiology or psychiatry, but in the field of sociology. I ran across one particular population study that was cited in an addiction paper I was reading, and that led to another and then many more. Before too long, I had a pretty complete picture of just who was primarily affected by this epidemic and why they were being affected. That led to some ideas of what I could say to them in the book that might have a bearing on the problem. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to share with you the who and the why and my current thoughts on the what. The other two W's, when and where, are simply the United States and the last 40 years, respectively. As we'll see, there's one demographic that is most affected by the problem, but that doesn't mean to imply that they're the only ones who are affected. Abuse of alcohol and other drugs is increasing across all demographics, with just a few notable exceptions. Instead of reading the facts and figures, I'll tell you what happened and provide my references. For those who may be interested, if you simply send me an email at pete@petesoderman.com, I'll send you a zip file with all my references. I regret the time constraints today preclude an in-depth review of the data, so I'll do my best to produce or present a coherent picture of what the studies say is happening. I'm going to be talking about mortality from three primary causes, which are suicide, opioid and other drug overdose, and alcohol-related liver disease, including cirrhosis. Sociologists refer to these as deaths of despair. We see the drug overdose epidemic as a recent phenomena, or at least one that began in the late 90s, driven by the predatory practices of the drug manufacturers. There is some truth to that, as far as opiates are concerned, but the epidemic itself actually began long before that. The fact is, the U.S. drug overdose epidemic has been tracking along an exponential growth curve since at least 1979. While the leading drugs, the primary affected populations, and geographic areas have changed over this time, the basic curve has not changed. The slope indicates a doubling every 9 years. The indications are that this epidemic will probably continue at least several years into the future. The current leading causes of overdose deaths are synthetic opioids, heroin, and prescription opioids in that order. But modern researchers aren't as concerned about which drug is the current drug of choice as they are about who is primarily affected and why. To see that, we have to pull back a little bit and look at other causes of mortality. Life expectancy in the United States and most developed countries has been increasing for the last 150 years rather steadily. There's a little ups and downs, but on the main it's been increasing. Life expectancy at birth in the United States declined in 2015 across the board for the first time since 1994, and it's still declining. What primarily drives the decline was a strong increase in mortality rates among middle-aged, white, non-Hispanics with less than a college degree. Among this demographic, mortality rates for suicide, drugs, and alcohol consumption are rising, while mortality rates from cardiovascular disease are no longer decreasing. In addition, pain, disability, and other measures of physical and mental health have been worsening among this population. By comparison, mortality rates among those with a college degree among white, non-Hispanic population continues to fall. Among the most affected demographic, which is rural or suburban white non-Hispanics 45 to 54 years of age with less than a college degree, drug and alcohol poisoning kills more people than lung cancer and diabetes combined. The rate of deaths of despair in this population is more than double that of similar populations in either Europe or Canada. Mortality rates for other age groups within this demographic are also rising rapidly. The CDC estimates that for each prescription painkiller death, there are 10 treatment admissions for abuse, 32 emergency department visits, 130 people who are abusers or dependent, and 825 non-medical users. We don't have such ancillary figures for alcohol deaths, but indications are that they'd be much higher. The population we are focusing on here includes both men and women and reaches nearly 60 million Americans. To understand the why, we have to look at some recent history. The fortunes of the American working class family crested during the 30-year period that followed the Second World War, when incomes rose sharply and prosperity spread more broadly than it ever had before. The average manufacturing wage more than doubled in purchasing power between 1950 and 1970, allowing for the first time large number of working class families to attain the middle class ideal of the single breadwinner household. The post-World War II era, many of us lived through it, was a unique period during which income inequality was at a historic low and industrial wages were high. Generally, a young man could walk out of high school find a job at a decent wage with good benefits, and the expectation of job security. Rising productivity and dominance in world trade allowed employers to pay historically generous wages while also earning substantial profits. The American dream was alive, well, and was being trumpeted from all the orifices of the rapidly expanding media. Those of us who lived through that period thought, or at least hoped, that it would never end. But it actually proved to be a historical anomaly. In 1973, OPEC initiated an oil embargo, the economy began a prolonged slump, and the post-war boom came to an end. In the 1980s and afterwards, many of the manufacturing jobs that had sustained the working class family either moved overseas or were eliminated by technology. As the economy was transformed, working class young adults struggled to sustain the male breadwinner marriage, but an increasing number of working class wives entered the labor force out of necessity. Today, there's no doubt that the marriage-based working class family is in decline. High school educated young adults still believe that a young man must have steady earnings in order to be worthy of marriage. Because fewer and fewer men meet this criterion, these young adults are increasingly postponing marriage altogether and instead forming short-term cohabiting relationships. They're also having children within these relationships. These both represent profound cultural shifts when compared to societal norms of only a few decades ago. The problem with the fall of the working class family from its mid-century peak is not so much that the male breadwinner family has declined. The problem is that nothing stable has replaced it. We're all familiar with the American dream, which is usually presented to include equal opportunity for success and upwards mobility for self and children, limited only by one's abilities and willingness to work hard. Americans have had this simple formula drilled into them for almost 80 years. But is it true? The short answer is no. It hasn't been true for some time. Children born in the 40s had a 90% chance of doing better than their parents, measured by income and other factors. By 1980, this had declined to 40% across the board, and indications are it is still dropping. For children born to working-class parents without a college degree, who have little chance of attending college themselves, the outlook is even grimmer. According to recent surveys, white non-Hispanic Americans without college degrees see only a 20% chance that their children will do better than they are doing. In contrast, black and Hispanic Americans are much more optimistic about the future. So what we appear to have developed in America is a permanent white underclass who see no way out of their predicament either for themselves or their children. The jobs they used to have are either gone to some other country or have been eliminated by technology, and they don't have the means to prepare themselves for well-paying jobs if and when they become available. I'm going to leave sociology and wander into neurophysiology for a moment to explain the relationship between the circumstances of working class Americans, deaths of despair, and the difficulty of recovering in this environment. To make it simple, we have a little counter in the primordial area of our brains far below our thoughts and feelings. It monitors exactly where we're positioned in society, say on a scale of 1 to 10. Its primary input is how we're treated by others and how we treat ourselves. If you're a 1, the highest number on the scale, you're a superstar, an overwhelming success. It means you have access to the best places to live, the best food, and unlimited opportunity. If you're at 10, the lowest number on the scale, you have nowhere to live, or at least nowhere good. Your food's terrible, if you have any. You're in poor mental and physical condition. You're of minimal romantic interest to anyone unless they're as desperate as you are, and you are more likely to fall ill, age rapidly, and die young. The reason for that is that if the counter perceives that you're judged by your peers as being of little use, it restricts serotonin availability. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, neuromodulator, the absence of which leads to decreased confidence and a higher stress response, therefore more illness and a shorter lifespan. When you're operating near the bottom of the food chain, living from paycheck to paycheck, even minor events can create high levels of stress, leading to increased anxiety and depression. To make things even worse, people living in these circumstances are failing to meet even their own expectations. Our zero-sum game culture has drilled into them since birth the fantasy of the American dream. So many believe they're in this situation because they couldn't or wouldn't work hard enough to succeed. So what develops is a self-reinforcing feedback loop among a population that's already in decline, leading many to seek relief, even temporary relief, wherever it may be found. It's easy not to take proper care of yourself when society is telling you repeatedly and in many different ways that you're of limited use. The result, as we have seen, is a significant portion of the U.S. population leading the world in deaths of despair. I've concentrated upon a particular demographic that has been particularly hard hit, but of course they're only a single piece of the puzzle. Some of the same problems are occurring across the country and affecting most demographics to some degree. People become addicted to all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons, developing self-defeating behaviors that are sometimes very difficult to resolve. Unfortunately, the factors that are driving what has become an epidemic of deaths of despair and addiction in general are not going to go away. The good-paying factory jobs that would allow the single breadwinner working families to return aren't coming back. Capitalism and technology have made certain of that. Equality, in the sense of fair sharing of productivity gains, as there was following World War II, is not going to return either. Our political system has seen to that. Do you see a politically viable way to make higher education accessible to poor and middle-class families without exposing them to a lifetime of onerous debt under our system? I don't. At least not as long as we spend nearly $1 trillion a year on defense. One of the necessities for a successful recovery is that the individual can see at least a possibility of a future life better than the one they have now. Without that, it's difficult for them to see the benefit of going through the effort necessary to make major changes in their life. So where does that leave us? Should we just let this exponentially growing population continue to fill our morgues, hospitals, and rehab centers and watch while the problem worsens in other demographics? I'll tell you one thing. No matter how many people we incarcerate for drugs, and we already lead the world in that category, or how much we spend on militarized police and interdiction, there will still always be plenty of drugs, legal and illegal. It's always been an individual problem, and it always will be. I promised some light at the end of the tunnel, and there is some. It lies in two particular areas, one being legal, the other in a gradual shift in mindset of the recovery community. There's still a great deal of disagreement in the medical community over whether addiction should be considered a disease or not. According to the American Psychiatric Association, it is. But then a large majority of addicts recover on their own. So there's that. Regardless of what anyone believes, calling it a disease has allowed the multi-billion-dollar rehab industry to balloon across the country, fueled by insurance payments. Historically, the industry has been notoriously underregulated, with no standard of care required in most cases. The largest majority of treatment centers are based upon the 12-step model of Alcoholics Anonymous, and multiple studies have shown that their success rate is less than 10%. California recently passed, and the governor signed, a series of bills aimed at cleaning up what some called the Wild West of treatment environments in California. One of the provisions states that licensed treatment centers in the state have to offer programs that adhere to treatment criteria established by the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which are evidence-based medical treatment protocols that include the use of new drugs that increase the chances for successful recovery. Most of the 12-step-based treatment centers do not allow either the use of drugs or any of the newer therapies, such as cognitive behavioral therapy. Treatment centers that use the newer evidence-based modalities, and there are several in the country now, have a success rate of 60 to 90%. California has taken a significant step, and I hope that other states follow suit. Until now, the research in the field of substance abuse has been largely focused on the pathology of addiction, with the aim of understanding why individuals become addicted in the first place. Even my first book devoted a couple of chapters to explaining what we currently know about the process of addiction. However, the addictions community is undergoing a major shift in thought, moving from a pathology-based focus to one that focuses on recovery. What resources does it take to achieve recovery? What are the patterns and stages in long-term recovery? And how can different factors work together to give individuals the tools they need to maintain abstinence? This new way of looking at things, looking at it from the standpoint of recovery rather than how you become addicted, has become known as the concept of recovery capital. Recovery capital is the internal and external resources needed for an individual to not only initiate, but maintain recovery from a self-defeating behavior. Recovery is an individual journey, and each person requires a different level of support and responds to different types of resources to achieve the goal. Recovery capital is broken into 4 different areas of a person's life, which brings focus to the individual and which resources each needs for a successful recovery. Incorporating the idea of recovery capital within addiction treatment calls for the recovery journey to begin by asking which resources need to be made available to support the long-term recovery of each and every person. It will be based on their unique background, needs, and personal experiences. One size doesn't fit all in recovery. And I'm pleased to see that even the treatment industry is beginning to realize it. This concept is being used as a model in several new programs throughout the country, both public and private. These are some hopeful signs, and I'm sure they will have a positive effect upon the general population, and I hope they will have some impact on the deaths of despair we've been discussing this morning. Some of the working poor and the most affected demographic have access to insurance and therefore treatment, but most don't. Most have access to self-help groups such as LifeRing, Smart Recovery, and AA, but typically only those who have some inkling of their situation and a desire to improve it show up there. Others are flagged when they overdose or when they survive a failed suicide attempt. But we don't provide long-term psychiatric care any longer. So for the most part, they're returned to the same environment they came from. The bottom line is that this epidemic will most likely continue to worsen as long as life in the United States continues to grow more stressful and chaotic. I wish I could be more optimistic this morning, but the data don't support optimism. Absent a strong effort on the federal level to mitigate the root causes of the epidemic. And that brings me to what I'm trying to write and to whom. Knowing of the existence of this primary demographic has influenced my direction a great deal. But I'm not going to address myself solely to that group. I'm going to take a much more generalized approach, but being sure to address as many of the issues of the most effective demographics as I can. Dealing with disorder or chaos is a common thread today, and it's addressed through modifying expectations, mindfulness, adapting belief systems to some new realities, improving self-image, reconnecting with family and society, and taking better care, or learning to take better care of our own needs. The world is not as it was even a short time ago, and it will continue to change as we move forward. In fact, change is the only constant. Therefore, there are no static external references for us to measure ourselves against. The only reliable reference that we have is our present selves versus our prior selves. To take advantage of that, of course, we have to know ourselves. And that's the whole point of recovering from any self-defeating behavior. I want to thank all of you for coming out this morning and being such a good audience. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Excellent. Now we have time for some questions, and if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and wait for a mic to come. Here we have. And if you could just stand, so hold the mic close to your mouth.
So was it a mistake for Canada and some of the U.S. states to legalize marijuana? Do we get to a George Orwell situation?
There continues to be everybody, the popular misconception is considering marijuana as a gateway drug. There's no hard evidence that it is. Okay? And the rest of it is all political and whatever, and I really don't want to get into that. But there's no evidence that we did ourselves any harm by doing that.
I was surprised. I knew the CDC data and the longevity data that surprised everyone a few years ago, but I thought it was mostly non-college educated white men. And I didn't know it included, women were the same thing. And I just wondered that. And the second part of my question is there a difference, do you think, in treatment for men and women? What in the way, in success?
Yes. To answer your last question first, yes, there are differences, and they're brought out in the recovery capital that I mentioned, because women's needs are different. Women's image needs are different, and some of the resources that women need to recover are different. So yes, on that. And women are affected to a lesser degree. That doesn't mean they're not affected. the same demographics, just a lesser degree. And the difference doesn't matter for purposes of looking at the thing as a whole.
And in longevity, they both went down.
Correct. Yes, both figures went down.
Okay, we have a question at the back.
I thank you very much for the information. I was fortunate to hear the other presentation. This was just a little more drastic. I do agree with you that change is constant. I just wanted to mention only one issue that I found a little weak. It's a reference of the profit motive of the drugs that was not included. Democracy Now! Had a program, and I forgot, because of my age, the writer, in reference to a very prominent family in New York who has benefited a lot with the introduction of drugs, and now is introducing, if you know about it, I want you to let me know, a pill or a recovery. So in other words, what I'm saying here is excellent what you're covering, but let's focus also on who is benefiting and who is dying. Thank you very much.
Okay. I did mention the, I don't know if this is what you were talking about, but what I understood was that the profit motive in the whole thing is in two places. It's in the drug companies, okay? And I did mention that briefly. I jumped off of it because the epidemic actually started being noticed in 1979. The increase in deaths of despair was mentioned in 1979. That was 20 years before the drug companies decided that would be their new business model. There's also a profit motive in, of course, in the whole recovery industry. That's another thing, and I don't suppose as long as we have the health insurance setup that we have, or the health setup that we have, I don't see that going away.
In this morning's paper from back home, there was an article about a young man, very successful fishing career, owned a few boats, went into the hospital, 31 years old, got put on prescription drugs, got addicted, and within a few months he picked up the habit and died. How common is that type of incident, that people do go into the hospital and get put on prescription drugs and get addicted?
Unfortunately, all too common. And also, unfortunately, some of the drug companies have messed around with their drugs to make them more addictive, not less. The same thing the cigarette companies did. Okay, exactly the same thing. Unfortunately, that is a common thing. These drugs are addictive, and people that notice that the drugs have other uses, people that never took these kinds of drugs before, these drugs have other uses that, it makes this other thing go away too. That's neat. I think I'll just keep taking that kind of thing, and eventually you will become dependent. I like the word dependent more than addicted, because addicted is kind of a loaded term. But yeah, it's all too common.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your talk. You sort of implied early on that the root source of the problem was the neoliberal economy model. And do you see any hope in that is going to restore hope for the middle classes and the lower classes?
Only if it goes away. Only if it goes away. And this entire subject skirts politics. And it's deeply involved in politics. I didn't want to get into politics. But obviously, there were things that were done in the 70s and 80s that drove that entire population. And it is a population. We're talking about 60 million people here, okay? They're not just a basket of deplorables. They're human beings, okay, who had one life, and that life was taken away. And to be perfectly honest, when I saw what this was, it made perfect sense to me. Of course, that's what it is. Okay, of course, that's what's driving this. You know, I had to prove it. You know, but of course it would. See, I am a member of that demographic. I never graduated college. I went in the Navy right out of high school. Took night school. When I got out, I went to college at night. Had all the engineering and math courses for a double E, but I never completed the humanities end of it. So as a result, I don't know how to pronounce anything, but I know what a lot of things are. It didn't hit me. Luckily, I got into the computer business early and developed some skills that were very much in demand that sustained me basically into the 90s, which is when it hit me in the face. And I tried to enter the normal job market and found myself severely restricted. So I'm a member of that demographic. So I take it rather personally that's what happened. Because many of us remember that environment in the 50s and 60s when indeed you could walk out of high school and get into an apprenticeship program and make good money and support your family and whatnot. Can't do that anymore.
What is the rate of growth of the demographic that you mentioned, the 45 to 54, white male, non-Hispanic, non-college educated? How are they in comparison to other demographics in terms of the rate of growth? Are all demographic segments increasing in the rate of growth?
I'm not a sociologist, so I'm not familiar with how to make this stuff clear, as I am in some other areas. But basically, the driver is the working class, the non-college educated. All the age groups within that demographic are growing at deaths of despair at different rates. The one that's growing the fastest is the 45 to 54. But you don't want to get hung up on that stuff. The fact is, this is the problem. This is why it's happening. This is why it's not going to go away. Okay? And until and unless some of the root causes are developed or go away. And your guess is as good as mine as the chances of that happening.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. My question is, you mentioned that the forward-thinking state of California, the rehab centers that they have got there are employing some different methods that are successful, medication, I don't know, what other methods you were, psychological or sociological, that you were referring to. I just wondered what some of those success methods that they are using are, what they are, that are different.
Okay. Well, there are a couple of drugs out that act in different ways, and it's not important what they do, but they can make it easier for a person to achieve a successful recovery. And there's also therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy and some others that the thing about recovery, okay, the thing that's most important in recovery is offering choice. Because one size doesn't fit all. It turns out that studies show, I keep using that term studies show, but it's better than me saying, well, I think. About 50% of the people who approach recovery respond to a spiritual type approach. The other 50% don't, for whatever reason. They respond best to a cognitive approach, such as life-ring smart recovery or just cognitive behavioral therapy-based programs, coupled with the recovery capital idea, which is taking an individual and seeing what areas of their life are lacking in the kind of support that they need and teaching them how to go get that, okay? How to reconnect with their family, how to reconnect with society, how to educate themselves, how to pay rent. I mean, you name it. And different individuals require different levels of support in different areas of their life, and determining that is very important. It's a focusing on recovery rather than what got you there, because what got you there really doesn't matter all that much.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. I'm impressed with your look at the research, and you've come at this as not being a professional, which I think is where a lot of the good really comes from. My question is your personal story on your website? Because it is the personal story that really makes the research live. So I'm very interested in your personal journey and your personal story and how that connects to what the professionals are saying.
A lot of it is in my first book, in different parts. I relate different parts of my story as I go through the book. But there is no biography, in fact. You know, this is in a sense of what you might hear in an AA meeting, someone going over their personal story. There's nothing like that in there.
Well, we got a question there, sorry.
Pete, do you think the relationship between job status and self-esteem is particularly acute in the United States as compared to other countries?
It is, and the reason it is, I mean, other countries are suffering the same kind of thing, okay? The United States is not unique in that respect. What the difference is the expectation. It's the American dream aspect. It's, I'm failing because I'm not meeting this expectation over here, and that thing that I see advertised every night when I watch television, I can't get that for my kids, and it looks like everybody else can, kind of thing. So it's the expectation versus the reality that is unique in the United States. Europeans, I don't believe, I'm not European, Europeans I don't believe have that expectation.
I have a question here.
Thank you. It seems you've addressed the situation as to where we are today. What can be done about the future to eliminate this problem? Where does responsible parenting enter into all of this?
There are a lot of different sociological aspects to this problem, obviously. And I do not even pretend to know the answers for it. However, as I've said a couple of times, the root source of the problem is actually more financial. It's more economic than it is anything else. Obviously, there's a sociological aspect to it. But you have an entire population that's, again, not meeting its own expectations. That's a very difficult thing to overcome. Very difficult. And again, it's an individual kind of thing. You have to catch individuals at a certain point. And there are people within that demographic who aren't affected by this at all. Okay, obviously. But it kind of is what it is. And I'm sure there's people working in that area. But because of my background and experience, I'm not one of them.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you again, Pete. And thank you all for a wonderful conversation afterwards. That was very good. If we... So if you can pick up your coffee cups, stack your chairs, we look forward to seeing you next Sunday.